In the second half of the 20th century, only two countries in the Eastern Bloc produced mass-market off-road vehicles, the Soviet Union and Romania. ARO models were often called the Romanian Land Rovers, and that comparison was meant quite seriously. These vehicles were exported with confidence, including to several capitalist countries. But how well-deserved was that reputation? And could ARO truly be considered the best off-road vehicles in the Eastern Bloc? The history of the Romanian manufacturer ARO goes back to the late 19th century. At that time, however, it was not called ARO and had nothing to do with automobiles. It was a pulp processing factory, which ceased operations by the beginning of the 20th century. In the 1930s, the facility was placed into long-term conservation. The company received a second chance in the first post-war years, during the early phase of socialist reconstruction in Romania. For the Romanian automotive industry, the late 1940s and early 1950s were a period of stagnation, or more accurately, a time when a domestic car industry barely existed at all. Civilian and military vehicles used in Romania were imported from other socialist countries, primarily from the Soviet Union. At the same time, the Soviet automotive industry itself was still recovering from the war and was far from operating at full capacity. As a result, the range of vehicles supplied to Romania was very limited. Most of the imports consisted of GAZ-69 off-road vehicles, delivered mainly for military use. As their numbers grew, the need for centralized maintenance became obvious. The buildings of the former processing plant were repurposed as repair workshops, where military vehicles of the Romanian armed forces, as well as Soviet units stationed in the country, were serviced. The next step for the factory was the production of spare parts, primarily for the GAZ-69 off-road vehicle. At the same time as the workforce gained experience, the company even attempted to launch motorcycle production. The effort was unsuccessful. Only 12 motorcycles were built, but the attempt itself marked an important turning point. The plant had proven it could manufacture vehicles of its own. It was also clear, however, that developing an entirely new model from scratch was beyond the factory's capabilities. A proven starting point was needed. That starting point turned out to be the Soviet GAZ-69. The first Romanian off-road vehicle was designated IMS-57, with the numbers indicating the year production began. While it was not considered a direct copy of the Soviet original, the similarities were obvious, even if there were also meaningful differences. The most important difference was the engine. The Soviet GAZ-69 used a relatively modern 2.1-liter engine derived from the Pobeda passenger car. These engines, however, were never supplied to Romania. The reason was simple. The Soviet Union barely had enough of them for its own needs, and export was not an option, even to Allied countries. As a result, Romanian engineers had no choice but to use a domestic engine of their own. It was an outdated pre-war design, a 3.2-liter unit producing 50 horsepower. Despite this limitation, the factory moved quickly to improve its first model. Just 2 years later, the IMS M59 appeared. Externally, it looked much like the original GAZ-based vehicle, but it featured a series of upgrades, ranging from electric windshield wipers to a more powerful engine. The most advanced vehicle of this first generation was the IMS 461. Its modern 2.5-liter engine allowed a top speed of 100 kilometers per hour, and overall build quality had improved to a level where the factory's products could finally be shown abroad without embarrassment. By the mid-1970s, however, the era of adapting the GAZ-69 was coming to an end. In 1975, all models based on its design and components were discontinued. Total production by that point had exceeded 80,000 vehicles, nearly 60% of which were exported. When work began on the next generation, Romanian engineers no longer looked to the Soviet Union for guidance. Their goal was to create an off-road vehicle capable of competing in Western European markets. It was during this period that the company adopted the name ARO, short for Automobile Romania. The new generation was officially presented in 1969 at the Bucharest Motor Show, with series production of the ARO 24 beginning in 1972. The lineup consisted of 5 variants: the ARO 240 with an open 2-door body, the ARO 241 with an open 4-door body, the ARO 242 pickup, the closed 2-door ARO 243, and the four-door closed ARO 244. There was nothing revolutionary about the ARO 24. It was a conventional all-purpose off-road vehicle for its time. A body-on-frame layout, a durable rear axle, and selectable four-wheel drive with a low-range transfer case. The gasoline 2.5-liter four-cylinder produced 80 horsepower. On the highway, the vehicle could reach around 120 kilometers per hour, with fuel consumption of about 13.8 liters per 100 kilometers, typical figures for an off-road vehicle of the early 1970s. At the same time, the ARO 24 was not purely utilitarian. The front suspension used independent springs, which gave the vehicle more stable and predictable behavior on paved roads. Off-road capability was equally solid. Climbs of up to 70 degrees, unprepared water crossings of 60 centimeters, and a payload exceeding 700 kilograms. In the 1970s, only a few vehicles offered a similar combination of capabilities: Jeep, Land Rover, and Japanese body-on-frame Toyotas. They all shared one thing in common. They were significantly more expensive than the ARO, which explains why the Romanian vehicle began attracting interest from foreign markets. The Romanian off-roader had, in essence, one serious drawback: a weak engine. The 2.5-liter unit carried over to the ARO 24 from the previous generation. For the domestic market and military use, it was barely adequate. But on export markets, this engine was no longer competitive, and with it, the vehicle lost much of its advantage. The issue was addressed by fitting purchased engines. Over the years, ARO offered gasoline units from Chrysler and Toyota, as well as diesel engines from Peugeot. Starting in 1974, buyers could also order the vehicle with a British Perkins diesel rated at 69 horsepower. Naturally, these upgrades increased the price, but even then, the ARO remained noticeably cheaper than comparable European and Japanese off-road vehicles. Competition from the Soviet Union was also limited. The Lada Niva, which sold successfully in Western Europe, appeared later and belonged to a different class, so it was not a direct rival. UAZ effectively removed itself from the export market altogether. The UAZ 469, which replaced the GAZ 69, was a purely utilitarian vehicle built under military supervision and intended for army service. It was exported only in very small numbers and exclusively to friendly countries. As a result, the ARO 24 found itself largely alone on the Western market, a situation that worked strongly in its favor. The market received the vehicle very warmly. In West Germany, prices started at 10,500 Deutschmarks, or about $3,600 at the time, roughly $20,500 in today's money. The factory warranty covered 6 months or 15,000 kilometers. From the outset, buyers could order the vehicle with a selection of commonly needed spare parts and options, while the list of available upgrades was unusually broad, from factory decals and wheels to full-body repainting in a specified color, as well as the optional engines already mentioned. On average, around 10,000 off-road vehicles were exported each year. This was a strong result, bringing in much-needed hard currency. The flexibility of the Romanian manufacturer played an important role in the model's export success. ARO off-road vehicles were supplied to many countries, including the United States, Canada, and Australia. In Spain and Portugal, the vehicles were even assembled locally, under the names Hisparo and Portaro, though production there was limited in scale and duration. Out of roughly 125,000 vehicles produced by 1985, about 93,000 were exported. Within Romania itself, ARO vehicles were widely used by the army and police, while five-door wagons often served as official transport for mid-level government officials. Private ownership was difficult. Buyers needed ministerial approval, a 50% advance payment, and waiting periods that could stretch to several years. As a result, when sales were later opened more broadly, ARO vehicles briefly carried a sense of prestige on the domestic market. That status was indirectly reinforced by Romania's leader, Nicolae Ceausescu. In 1977 to 1978, 4 special ARO 304 vehicles were built on an extended chassis with rear-wheel drive only. 2 were assigned to Ceausescu himself, while the others were presented to East German leader Erich Honecker and Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi. Unusually for cars of this class, the body color was not black but a light sky blue, making Ceausescu's vehicles stand out from the otherwise uniform motorcades of other world leaders. At the same time, engineers continued to refine the production models. The first facelift came in 1977 and focused on the front end, where rectangular headlights were replaced by round ones. 5 years later, the front fascia was redesigned again, introducing plastic body panels, a new energy-absorbing dashboard, and wider 15-inch wheels. It was in this form that the Romanian off-roader entered the period that would soon be defined by the collapse of socialism in the country. In the archives of the automotive industries of the socialist bloc, there are many distinctive and original projects that, with rare exceptions, reached the end of their stories in much the same way. And almost at the same time, in the late 1980s, ARO was no exception. During the 1970s and 1980s, Romanian off-road vehicles found buyers even in prosperous Western Europe, largely due to a successful combination of solid engineering and low pricing. Quality was never ideal, but at the time, there was a workable balance between affordable cost and an acceptable level of build. By the late 1980s, that balance began to collapse, driven in part by the overall aging of the model. The situation was compounded by instability across the entire socialist bloc. In the midst of a systemic crisis, there were simply no resources available to develop a truly new vehicle. As a result, orders from Western Europe for Romanian off-road vehicles declined sharply and then disappeared altogether. A facelift in 1998 and the introduction of an in-house turbo diesel engine producing 88 horsepower briefly improved the situation. On the domestic market, the vehicles still attracted some demand. Even so, it was clear that the life cycle of the ARO 24 was coming to an end, and a proper successor was never prepared, despite several attempts. In 1998, a prototype known as ARO 26 was presented, but it never reached production. Detailed technical information has largely been lost, but it appears to have been an attempt to create a new generation using the existing chassis. The project ultimately failed due to a lack of funding. The final ARO vehicles left the assembly line in 2006. Shortly after that, the ARO brand and the factory itself ceased to exist. Over nearly 50 years of operation, the Romanian manufacturer produced around 380,000 vehicles, including the early IMS models, the ARO 24 family, and the compact ARO 10, which deserves a separate story of its own. Can the ARO 24 be called the best off-road vehicle of the Eastern Bloc? Most likely, yes. Compared to ARO, the UAZ fell short in terms of comfort, build quality, and overall versatility. The Lada Niva, despite its impressive off-road capability, belonged to a different class altogether, and its buyer base only partially overlapped with that of ARO. Taking these distinctions into account, the ARO 24 can reasonably be considered the most well-rounded and capable off-road vehicle produced in the Eastern Bloc.